and Central Interior AGMPD session. First, I would like to acknowledge with gratitude and respect the Wet'suwet'en peoples on whose traditional territory I live, work, and play as an uninvited guest, and whose historical relationships with the land and waters continue to this day. I would like to also mention some housekeeping rules for today's workshop. This workshop is planned for 2.5 hours total. Justin and Trevor will be presenting during the first 2 hours of the workshop, and then we'll have 30 minutes at the end for discussion. There will be a 10-minute break somewhere in the middle of the workshop. And if you would like to clarify a specific topic presented, please type your question in the questions for presenters chat box that is available in your screen. Justin and Trevor will be happy to answer those type of questions during the workshop. However, if you have comments or questions that might generate discussion, please share them at the end of the presentations. So today, Justin Stryker and Trevor Baker will be giving us a workshop entitled Evolving Approaches for Mine Reclamation in British Columbia. Justin is a soil scientist and a forest ecologist and a founder of the Integral Ecology Group in Duncan, British Columbia. He has more than 20 years of experience in applied terrestrial ecology with a primary focus on identifying and repairing the effects of human activities on terrestrial ecosystems. During the last decade, Justin has worked on the ecological aspects of cover design, on developing improved methods for estimating hydrological regimes on reclamation sites, and on understanding the eco-hydrological interactions of soils, vegetation, reclamation treatments with larger hydrological cycles in mine waste landforms. Trevor Baker is a soil scientist at Integral Ecology Group as well, specializing in plant-soil interactions and reclamation cover design. With 8 years of experience in mine reclamation planning, monitoring, and research, he has been involved in numerous projects on mine sites in Canada in both pre-disturbance and reclamation environments. Trevor is currently pursuing his master's degree in soil science at UBC, focused on developing water balance-based ecological classification tools for use in mine reclamation. I would like to thank Team Antil for helping us organizing this workshop. Thanks to Sia for helping us out with all the logistics associated with this event. And thank you to our speakers, Justin and Trevor, today for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. So with that, I'll pass the floor to Justin and Trevor.
Thanks very much, Adriana. And yeah, thanks very much for all of you who've joined online. Unlike Adriana, I've got, as they used to say in the old days, a great face for radio, so I'll keep my camera off. But yeah, thanks again. So we're going to talk about evolving approaches for mine reclamation in British Columbia, and given the venue today, I thought it's important to emphasize right off the bat that what we're really talking about when we talk about mine reclamation is the kind of work that agrologists would be involved in mine reclamation. So generally, design of soil covers or covers that use materials that are related to soils to support establishment of ecosystems, vegetated ecosystems on mine sites. So not the kind of broader stuff that mine reclamation can encompass, like geochemistry, etc., but really the work of agrologists and related professions. Oh, I'm gonna learn to use the right keys to advance this. So I guess I would say that I'm not a fan of probably PowerPoint presentations in general and outlines of PowerPoint presentations more specifically, although I did really enjoy this TED Talk I saw once from the actor and director Taika Waititi, whose outline of his presentation looked like this. But I thought that given the length of today's presentation, it would be helpful to at least give you some idea of what you're in for. The most important, sorry, I'm just still trying to, there we go. The most important times, I guess, are the fact that it's just after 1 now and we're going to end at 3:30. And as Adriana said, we're going to have a break in the middle so you can get up and, you know, get a drink and stretch your muscles and slap your face. In the period before the break, I'm going to mostly provide an extended introduction to the topic and some context, basically trying to get at what are we, and by we I mean all of us who do this kind of work, what are we trying to do in mine reclamation and why do we think it's important? And I want to outline the technical challenges and provide some background to those technical challenges. And then after the break, Trevor is going to speak in more detail about technical approaches and a tool that we've developed to try to support people in addressing some of these challenges. And then for the last half hour, if we're on time and run everything correctly, we'll have 30 minutes for kind of open discussion, which I'm looking forward to. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is mining as a land disturbance. And this, the text on the left-hand side of this slide comes from some work done by, well, a legend in the BC mine reclamation community named Andy Robertson. Andy's an engineer originally from Africa, but he's been working in BC for 40 years or so. And he started studying, and he's given a few talks on this. Just as a side note, I've tried to put, as well as the Taika Waititi talk, I've tried to put links to things that are available on the web throughout the presentation. I understand the presentation's being recorded, so you can kind of use them as references. And I think Trevor has a reference slide at the end. I could not find an online version of one of Andy's presentations, but Andy's done this really interesting work basically looking at the evolution of mining as an industry from about 1900 till now. And what he's found was that in general, every 30 years in the mining industry, the milling rates of kind of an average mine of the time have increased by a factor of 10. So the waste volumes that are generated by an average mine of the time increases by a factor of 10. The area increases by about a factor of 5. And interestingly, just keep this in mind for a couple slides ahead, Andy's estimation was that risk increases by about a factor of 20 every 30 years. And that kind of goes along with sort of it's corresponds to increases in dam heights and waste dump heights and volume of waste contained behind tailings dams, things like that. So as an illustration, in 1900, you know, almost all mines are either tiny or underground. They might have a surface disturbance, say, of 10 hectares of, you know, little waste, above ground waste dumps, etc. By 1930, maybe the average mine is, you know, about 50 hectares in size. By 1960, maybe you have mines that are 250 hectares in size. By the 1990s, we have mines that are more than 1,000 hectares in size. And by now we have mines that are approaching or exceeding 10,000 hectares in size. So if you look at the image on the right-hand side is probably familiar to those of you who've done this kind of work, but it is a satellite image of the surface mines of the Athabasca oil sands region north of Fort McMurray. And so that image is about 70 by 70 kilometers. And there's about 7 mines or so, depending on how you divide them up in this picture. But for instance, the mine in the bottom left that says Athabasca Deposit Alberta Oil Sands over it, I think that's what it says, is Syncrude's Mildred Lake mine. That footprint is about 20,000 hectares. And so, you know, in line with the idea that by the 2020s, we've got mines that are, you know, in the thousands of hectares, if not in the tens of thousands of hectares. So as a land disturbance in BC, it's a little bit more modest than that, but at the time that we'll see in a minute, legislation regulations requiring land reclamation in British Columbia were introduced at the end of the 1960s. And at that time, there was less than 1,000 hectares of mining land or land disturbed by mining. And I put a little picture in here. This is the Highland Valley Copper Mine in BC. It's the largest single mine disturbance. It's at the same scale as those oil sands mines. So you can see that it's not as big as any of them individually, except the very new ones, but it's comparable. So Highland Valley has a disturbance of something like 6,000 or 7,000 hectares compared to Mildred Lake's 20,000 hectares. And in the year 2000, John Arrington, who was then the reclamation inspector with the BC Ministry of Energy and Mines, put this table together, which showed the area of disturbance and reclamation over those kind of first 30 or so years from when reclamation began to be required till the time the paper was written. Now, it's interesting. I've been working with Tim, who Adriana mentioned, trying to see if we have an update to this, and we're not totally sure about, maybe we have more accurate numbers, and so we're not totally sure that this, 40,000 hectares is the way we would look at it nowadays in terms of mining disturbance. But I guess the point is, although this is not the oil sands, this is still a large disturbance in the province. So, mine reclamation is a mitigation of mining disturbance. So reclamation legislation, as I said, was first introduced first required for major mines in 1969. The size of reclamation bonding held by the province have increased by about 20 times every 30 years. That's the slope of the line they're on since that time in 1969, which is kind of interestingly directly in line with Andy Robertson's, finding of risk increasing by about 20-fold every 30 years. So the size of the reclamation security right now is just under, you have a couple ministry people, so you guys can correct me if you know I'm wrong, who are online. But, it's just under about $2 billion right now, and the estimated liability is about just under $3 billion. So I just want to talk a little bit about a history of mine reclamation in BC, and I chose this photo because you can see many of the examples of the things I want to talk about, at least in the early phases, in one photo. So pre-1969, there's no reclamation required, and in the bottom of the photo, those long waste dump faces, this is waste rock that came out of the pit, so or rock that is blasted and deposited out of those. It would have come from those two pits that you see in sort of the center of the picture. The stuff on the bottom of the picture doesn't need to be required. This mine started in the doesn't need to be reclaimed. This mine started in the 1960s. These waste deposits were built prior to the reclamation legislation, and so they have no requirements for reclamation. In the next kind of 20 years, there was really a primary focus on establishing some kind of plant ground cover, mostly for what was thought of in those days as kind of soil building and erosion control. So one of the things that happened a lot was grass and legume, mixtures of agronomic grasses and legumes were used, and the idea was, if we can produce enough biomass from these things, their above ground litter will fall over and decompose, below ground roots will decompose, and we'll slowly be adding organic matter to the materials they're growing in. Now, the approach in those days, and you can sort of see it, I'm assuming that folks cannot see my pointer. I'm not sure if there is a kind of pointer option in here, but if you look just above those reclaimed waste rock dumps, there's some kind of green areas. those are areas of waste rock that's been seeded directly with these agronomic species. So in those days, we were, there was very little, if any, soil salvage. And we were basically trying to reclaim mine waste materials, both waste rock and tailings, which is the byproduct of running ore through the mill. So, sorry, I just got distracted by one of the comments. It's, this is the original Bethlehem copper mine, which is now part of the Highland Valley copper mine. It's really not important what the mine is, just because I'm just using it as an example. But so direct revegetation of tailings and waste rock under this kind of paradigm of soil building and erosion control. From about 1990 to 2010, there's an increasing emphasis on native species establishment and the use of organic amendments to try to improve what is still largely, for the most part, soil-less reclamation scenario. Although in 1996, the modern BC Environmental Assessment Office, or BC Environmental Assessment Act, came out, and the Huckleberry mine was the first mine approved through that process and included soil salvage. But for the most part, soil salvage had been pretty notably absent. So in this kind of 2 decades from 1990 to 2010, there's an increasing emphasis on native species establishment. Some of that is actually taking place in this picture, but it's hard to point it out. It doesn't, it's not kind of big enough to be very visible. There's lots of things that are visible about the increasing use of organic amendments. So in the kind of back left, right in front of the water body that is a tailings pond, you can see these little strips of kind of brown revegetated areas, which were initial research plots using biosolids or dewatered sewage sludge to do reclamation. And just to their right, there's a kind of fairly dark brown patch on the next tailings impoundment to the right, which is fresh biosolids application. So people are starting to experiment with how can we use other products to maybe improve reclamation outcomes. The era we're in now, I think, features even more emphasis on native species establishment, more complexity in ecosystem reestablishment, some biodiversity commitments through the Mining Association of Canada's towards sustainable mining of no net loss, or even companies making commitments to having net positive impacts on biodiversity. And also, I think really importantly, the beginning of a focus on traditional Indigenous land uses, or Indigenous land uses more generally, as an important focus for reclamation and land uses. I wanted to go a little bit into where we go from here. So I've got that bullet in the bottom that says 2030 to 2050, bunch of question marks. The idea is that, we're starting, especially in more populous areas, to think about other uses we might put mine land to. So about 10, So I think for the most part, this slide is taken from a talk given by Dr. Ann Nath at the University of Alberta. And I thought nicely sort of illustrated this idea of different potential outcomes in mine reclamation, with the sort of central tendency that we've been following in British Columbia, at least over the last short while, illustrated in red, where really what we're trying to do, we don't generally call this restoration in the mine reclamation field in British Columbia, but what we're generally trying to do is replace either original ecosystems or kind of as close as possible, as comparable as possible to original ecosystems. And that's really the paradigm we're after. But you can see in the top left of Ann's graph this sort of idea about alternative reclamation states. So about 10 years ago, this book came out, 101 Things to Do with a Hole in the Ground, from the UK, which sort of talked about what if we took, mining land and, made landscape scale art with it, or installed museums or something like that. So people starting to think about other things you could do with mine lands. Of course, BC has its own famous example of this, the ex-quarry in Bouchard Gardens. Now, I discovered this on the web, the idea that a former heavily coal-mined area of what used to be East Germany has now been turned into, the pits from which coal extracted have been filled with water and turned into a kind of lake district, a tourism district. And down in Kimberley, a solar power plant installed on the Sullivan mine, which I interestingly found on the cover of this report with this title you see here from Australia. So this is something we're talking about kind of more and more. But I sort of want to go back to this slide to emphasize that it's probably foolish of us, and we don't really have the ability to understand to fully understand what society is going to want to use these lands for in the future. And so it's really important that we still focus on our ability to reclaim conditions that have the capability to support the kind of ecosystems which would naturally occur in an area, or this red trajectory of trying to replace original ecosystems, regardless of what we actually do for temporary periods of time with these land bases. If we choose to do something else, we want to maintain this capability for ecosystem support. And that's really where the talk that Trevor and I, there's really the focus of our talk today is focusing on this kind of trajectory. So the summary of kind of all that is mine reclamation is relatively new, right? We've been doing it on this like large industrial scale for about 50 years in British Columbia. I'd say that, kind of encompasses the careers of about 4 generations of people. The folks who were first involved in mine reclamation when the legislation came in are certainly not working in the field anymore. The sort of next generation, the first generation of folks who were actively involved in mine reclamation in its early days are retiring now. I'm probably the kind of 3rd generation of people who've worked in it, and Trevor's kind of the 4th. So it's relatively new. It occurs over large land areas in British Columbia and Canada. It occurs over long time scales. So we have many mines, well, at least 2 or more in British Columbia, which started in the 1960s and are still operating. So these are mines that have been operating for 60 years. That's a long time to, there's the people who work on these mines then and work on reclamation on these mines span kind of multiple generations, and the time frame over which land is removed from other land uses is spans multiple generations. So we're working on these things over long time periods, and that introduces a couple particular challenges. One is that societal expectations around what mine reclamation should be are changed. They changed kind of multiple times within the lifespan of a mine. So in my working career, which started in the late 1990s, I've seen some fairly substantial changes in what we're expecting from mine reclamation. And I would say they're for the good, but they make it complicated to do reclamation, where you might start with one goal in mind, and before you're even approaching closure, you might have, those goals are shifting. And it also brings in the problem of shifting physical and biophysical conditions, probably most prominently climate change. So when I started working on mine reclamation, we never discussed climate change. It wasn't a thing we thought about in mine reclamation. By 10 years after that, it was certainly something we thought about, but didn't really know what to do about it. And what we sort of said was, well, there's so much uncertainty in projections that it's best to just carry on. And we know that climate has been changing and is changing, but we don't know what to do about it, to the point that we're at now, where I think many of us would agree that climate change is substantial enough, has been going on for long enough, and is large enough in magnitude that we can not make reclamation designs to without considering its effects. So what that all adds up to is that this is a technically complex issue. So I'm going to start a kind of second piece of this extended introduction, and Adriana, I can stop here and see if there's any questions that you want to address now. In general, the kind of more discussion questions we'd like to kind of hold till the discussion at the end, but if there's things we said that need clarification as we move along, we're happy to take those questions.
Thanks, Justin. I think John Stevenson might have a couple of questions. I just wanted to remind people, if you guys want to ask questions for the presenters, use the other chat, not the one that says questions for presenters. So anyways, so John is asking, will there be tailings in that recreational lake in Germany? And if they are covered with water, then are they inert? I don't have a clue. Maybe specific elements?
Thanks, Adriana, and thanks, John. So probably not, because coal mining doesn't generate sort of tailings per se, although it can certainly generate, you know, byproducts of coal processing and washing that can sometimes look like tailings. It could be difficult to cover with water, and I think there was a response to your question that sort of indicated that, you know, if water covers result in suboxic conditions, that can sort of tame some of the issues associated with release of reaction products from things like tailings. But, you know, the honest answer is, in that particular case, I don't know the answer. I suspect not.
Okay, thanks, Justin. Luke Holstock just added a comment after John's. So oftentimes stratification helps and metals end up bound to sediment in the deeper water. However, that can be variable and it gets complex. And he added another comment saying, not to mention water cover mitigates the oxidation process.
Yeah, so I think that's similar. Similar comment I was making on suboxic conditions.
Exactly. And there is Kevin. There is another question. Is there a land use that is set aside for re-mining the tailings in the future?
I mean, I certainly think that that's something we're seeing happen in the industry is, you know, as technology advances, or even the things that we're interested in recovering advances. You know, we think about weird things like lithium and beryllium now that we didn't used to think so much about. There is interest in it. I don't think that it would be seen as an acceptable and land use. It would not be, let's remine this stuff. Ultimately, you know, what we're looking for in terms of end land uses is, once the mining process is done, what focus are we going to include in reclamation to, for a post-mining landscape?
There's sawdust there too, Ricky. From me cutting a board, there's sawdust out there.
Sorry, I just would like to remind people to mute their mic. Thank you. Okay, thank you. I don't see any more questions right now.
Okay, I'll carry on. Thanks very much, Adriana. And thanks for your questions, folks. So moving on to this idea of, you know, a central kind of idea in mine reclamation in British Columbia is mining is a temporary land use. And a lot of the guidance on reclamation comes from this document, the Health, Safety and Reclamation Code for Mines in British Columbia, which is part of the, you know, a piece of the Mines Act, or goes along with the Mines Act. And there's two clauses when we're thinking about these ideas of land use and end land use, two clauses that are pertinent. One says, the land surface shall be reclaimed to an end land use approved by the Chief Permitting Officer that considers previous and potential uses. So, one of the things this tells us is that we need to be specific about the kinds of end land uses for which we're planning in reclamation. It may be more than one, but we need to be specific about it. The second clause is around capability, and it says, excluding lands that are not to be reclaimed, the average land capability to be achieved on the remaining land shall not be less than the average that existed prior to mining. So these clauses introduce a couple technical challenges. One is that we need to be able to compare pre and post mine capability, right? The clause says that we need to be able to demonstrate that reclamation has returned a capability that is not degraded from the capability that we started with. And in British Columbia, you can sort of think of this under a kind of rental paradigm, right? The citizens of the province own the land because of most mining occurs on Crown lands. We own the lands. We make a deal with the mining company to share the proceeds of resource extraction through things like taxes and royalties. And at the end of the day, at the end of our agreement, we want the rental property returned to us in a non-degraded state. So in order to do that, because this is complex, we're dealing with complex issues, we need some sort of system that allows us to compare pre and post mine capability. And the second thing that kind of goes along with this, and it's not something we've talked about yet in this presentation, but another important technical challenge is to understand the way water moves through mining landscapes. This is often a driver both of kind of societal concerns around mining and a driver of how mines get designed. And so in this illustration, we're sort of trying to show a generic montane mining landscape. We've got mine waste being deposited by trucks on the left-hand side, and we've got some receiving water bodies sort of shown by a groundwater table. You can see is that dashed line with an arrow towards the bottom of the figure that eventually would connect with a surface water body. And so one of the things we want to think about is how does water move through this landscape and get affected by things like constituents of concern, like John was raising in his question about tailings in the East German mine sites, right? So water falls on this landscape, it infiltrates into waste rock, it moves through the waste rock, it might pick up products of reaction from that waste rock and end up in groundwater and or surface water. And as agrologists working on mine reclamation, if we're the people who kind of work in just to the left of that arrow, that kind of thin skin of soil with vegetation growing on it, the way I sort of think about it is if we're trying to establish these reclaimed ecosystems kind of have the right of first offer on that water falling as rain or melting snow. And they're going to change how it moves through the landscape. The soil can store the water for a period of time. If the plants can uptake that water, they can transpire it and return it to the atmosphere. And so one of the things we want to be thinking about as we're designing reclamation for things like returning land uses and capability is how are those decisions that we're making for those kind of reclamation objectives going to affect the way that water moves through the landscape, because they will affect them kind of whether we've thought about it or not. So based on those kind of two technical challenges, thinking about water, well, number one, thinking about how do we assess capability, and number two, thinking about water, that's sort of where we're going with the rest of my chunk of this presentation. So one way that we can think about assessing capability that has been used in the past and is maybe in this context kind of the original way of thinking about capability is to use soil and climate-based land capability classification systems. So on the right, I've got an example from the early 1980s in British Columbia, a manual on land capability classification for agriculture. And this is still useful and still used. And in a more reclamation specific way, another document, the land capability classification system for forest ecosystems in the oil sands. This document's from the mid-2000s. It was the document that was used by operators and the government to assess changes in capability through mining and reclamation in the oil sands for a period of time. And it's not used anymore, but it was in force for somewhat more than a decade. So the advantages of these kind of soil-based classification systems is that they're not affected by vegetation characteristics, right? They're relatively stable and are pretty agnostic of whether, you establish, a forest on a piece of reclaimed land or agronomic pasture. And that has some advantages in that, well, it's less complicated, right? Its disadvantages are basically the same. It's not affected by vegetation characteristics. And the problem with that is that a lot of our end land uses are affected by vegetation characteristics, right? So if we're trying to reclaim to a kind of wildlife habitat, the capability of that wildlife habitat will be affected by the kind of vegetation we're able to establish. It's not kind of good enough to say, well, the soil has the capability to provide great moose habitat. We actually have to provide more of the elements of great moose habitat. And similarly, for something like indigenous land uses, we can't just say, well, the soil is capable of supporting these land uses. We need to put more of the elements in place that are required by those land uses, including plants, etc., on the landscape. So capability classification system ends up being, I'm going to argue, kind of too unsatisfactory to really use for this purpose. So luckily in BC, we have an alternative in an ecosystem-based classification system. The biogeoclimatic ecosystem classification program has been under development in BC basically since post-World War II. There's been a ton of work and knowledge and effort and data put into this. And Trevor's going to talk about it in more depth a bit later, but really the only point I want to make right now is we're lucky to have it. This is probably one of the most advanced ecosystem classification systems and supporting work in North America, and is a real strength that we can use in our mine reclamation planning. So the advantages of using an ecosystem-based classification system, and particularly the BEC system, is it's very well established. Like I said, it's got a lot of work and knowledge behind it. And it already has links to some land uses, particularly wildlife habitat and forestry. So it's we can currently take knowledge of units within that classification system and understand what their capability is for producing, say, things like forest tree species, or we can link it to capability for wildlife habitat. The disadvantages of a system like the BEC system is that, number one, it's complex. I've been working almost entirely in mine reclamation and mostly in British Columbia for almost 25 years, and I'm still trying to sort of fulsomely wrap my head around this system and what it truly means. A second disadvantage is that there's the danger of implying, when we use the language of the BEC system for our pre and post mining comparisons of capability, there's a danger of implying wrongly that post mining ecosystems will be in some way, identical or virtually indistinguishable from pre-mine ecosystems. So if we say in this kind of language, we're going to eliminate 100 hectares of some site series in the BEC system through mining, but we'll replace 50 hectares of that site series, there's the danger of implying that they will be roughly equivalent in terms of form and function, which is probably not true. And the third disadvantage is that the BEC system doesn't link to some land uses of great importance. For instance, indigenous land uses, we don't have any kind of lookup tables like we have for forestry or wildlife habitat. We don't really have a template for how you would link, or at least not a province-wide kind of template for how you would link BEC site series to land uses. And so really the only way we could have something like that is with the help, kind of an equivalently immense amount of work and help from indigenous ecologists and indigenous experts in these land uses, which has not happened, at least in a way that's easily accessible for some of us. And so, this is a shortcoming and basically needs to be done on a site-by-site basis at this time. However, I'm still going to argue that this is the best tool we have as a basis for making capability comparisons and doing this kind of work associated with end land uses and reclamation design. So, want to talk a little bit about the need for a quantitative capability system and contrast it to what we've probably done in the past. And this is starting to point at some of the stuff that Trevor's going to talk about in the second half of this workshop. So in the past, we've largely used qualitative or at best kind of semi-quantitative approaches for reclamation design and for understanding capability. And as an example, I was in the late 2000s, I was working at a mine, and an engineer working at the mine designing a tailings cover said to me, "How thick does the growth medium of this cover need to be?" And my answer was about 50 centimeters. And he said, "Why?" And I said, "It's about what where most of the roots are in the surrounding ecosystems." And he said, "Can't you do some kind of classification to be a bit more, or can't you do some kind of calculation on things like, how much water is this cover storing to be more precise?" And at the time, my answer was no. Now, the disadvantages of a kind of, expert judgment-based kind of semi-quantitative or qualitative approach like that is that it's subjective and it's imprecise. And so this is sort of what started Trevor and I down the road of trying to come up with the system that Trevor's going to present on in more detail about a decade ago, which was this realization that we needed some more quantitative approaches to the work we were doing. A lot of the work that we do involves design of reclamation cover systems, so layers of soil or soil-like material that will be growth media for plants that we want to establish, and the links between those and the plants that we do establish. So, like I said, about 10 years ago, Trevor and I started down the road of trying to come up with a more quantitative system, partly to better interface with the engineers who mostly design these systems, but partly also for the reasons of the last two kind of dashed bullets on this slide. We wanted a more robust way of being able to actually demonstrate or compare pre-mining and post-mining capability and demonstrate achievement of capability objectives. And we wanted to be able to support more robust reclamation design, especially cover design of reclamation cover systems. So the little text box under the photo here is, I want to give you an idea of the magnitude of these decisions. Earth moving is the most expensive part of reclamation. On average, it would cost about $10,000 to $20,000 to salvage and place 10 centimeters of reclamation cover materials on 1 hectare of land. And that is in a situation in which cover materials are being salvaged and trucked directly to the place that they're going to be placed and placed, so that the truck that is moving them from the salvage area is dumping them on the placement area. And the range in costs is really about range and haul distances. So it costs more if you have to store these materials, which is the norm in reclamation. For the most part in reclamation, we salvage soil materials and other kinds of materials that we might use in reclamation covers. We store them in stockpiles and they sit there until we're ready to use them in reclamation, which adds costs because you have to double handle these materials. So the implication of this is on a 10 hectare area, every centimeter of reclamation cover that we add to our design has a $10,000 to $20,000 cost implication. And every 10 centimeters, because at least right now dozers don't work in 1 centimeter increments, every 10 centimeters of cover we adds $100,000 to $200,000 in costs. And a 10 hectare area is not a particularly large reclamation area. We in 2020 we planted about 40 hectares of area on a mine we work on. And so there, the cost implications of asking for a 10 centimeter increase in soil cover is, approaching $1 million. So these are, in order to justify expenses like that to the people who are, designing the covers and paying for them, it helps to have some robust kind of quantification of why these things are needed. Okay, the last bit of my introduction, I guess the last kind of 20 minutes before the break, has to do with this business about thinking about water movement through reclaimed landscapes. So this is not from British Columbia. This is a slide of a site in the Yukon. It is a mine waste rock dump. The gray that you see right above the vegetation is in fact a reclamation cover system made out of overburden, not soils. But despite the fact that this waste rock dump has a cover system, what you see is that water is landing on the waste materials. It's moving through those waste materials under the cover system, and it is emerging at the base of the waste rock pile, enriched with, well, in this case, it's low pH water. So this is acid rock drainage. It's low pH water. It's got high concentrations of zinc and lead, and it's causing the effects that you can see in the vegetation there, the staining and death. So, as I said before, this is often a driver of a lot of what we're doing in reclamation, is not only trying to reestablish ecosystems that support the end land uses that people want to see on post-mining landscapes, but mediating the movement of water through landscapes and doing as much as possible to prevent situations like this. So a pretty common concept in mine water management is that of keeping clean water clean. And often what we mean by that when we're talking about this in the mining context is diversion ditches, which are basically horizontal diversions, right? You've got water running off a landscape in creeks. If it's running towards mine features, what you'd like to do is put a ditch between those water systems and the mine, and divert them around the mine and dump them downstream into some receiving environment that hasn't been impacted by the mine. But one of the points that we want to make is that use of reclamation covers, vegetated reclamation covers, you can think of as sort of semi-permeable diversion ditches in a way, like a semi-permeable umbrella, right? And I was going to say that they're more complicated than diversion ditches, but they actually aren't, because it turns out that the diversion ditches are pretty complicated and they don't work as well as you want them to, because some water goes under them and they lose water. So this is a different kind of semi-permeable way of keeping clean water clean. But basically, if we can capture some of the water that gets delivered to mine reclamation landscapes and store it in soil covers and remove it through vegetation transpiration, we can keep a portion of that water that fell on the mine landscape. We can keep it from interacting with mine wastes and keep that water clean through those kind of atmospheric mechanisms as well. So in order to talk about this a bit, I want to talk about the idea of surface and subsurface water balances in reclamation. So this slide is meant to illustrate a couple alternatives in an imaginary mining landscape. So we have generic waste deposits on both sides of the creek. On one side, on the left-hand side, we've imagined a waste rock deposit with a thicker vegetation cover on it and a more robust vegetation community developed on it. And on the right-hand side, we've got a thinner cover with a sparser vegetation community. And the arrows that cycle through those waste rock deposits are meant to show that, again, if we think back to that slide where I first talked about water and said, the things we do in reclamation matter to the way water moves through the landscape. These arrows that are cycling through these waste rock deposits are meant to show the difference that different reclamation treatments make and the implications for that of the surface water balance, which we're going to talk about a bit more in a bit, to the larger subsurface water balance through those waste rock dumps that is eventually heading towards some receiving environment. The grids on both sides are meant to represent, in a schematic way, the ecotopic grids, the biogeoclimatic ecosystem classification. Trevor's going to talk a bit more about them, but basically trying to show corresponding with the illustration of the cover thickness and the amount of vegetation, the fact that these would be different vegetation communities or different ecosystems in the BEC system, and the one on the left would be a kind of more nutrient moderate and water a wetter or more mesic ecosystem, and the one on the right would be more nutrient poor and drier. So in order to think more about this, we want to think about how we express the surface water balance, and we can write it as Q equals P minus E minus delta S, where P is precipitation as rain and melting snow, which is illustrated. E is evaporation, including transpiration. And you can see what we've tried to illustrate is that the size of the wiggly arrows associated with evaporation on the left-hand side and the more robust ecosystem are larger than the wiggly arrows on the right-hand side. Delta S is the change in water storage in the rooting zone, and sort of analogous in the stuff we're going to talk about in a minute to the amount of water that rooting zone can store. And the result of those terms, Q is the net flux, which can be partitioned in the surface runoff, and net percolation or flux into the groundwater, which is the larger water balance moving through the waste rock dump. And we're just going to talk a little bit about some of these different terms. So if we think about precipitation and evaporation in the water balance, this is an example of graphed precipitation in blue and evaporation in green for a mine site that we're working on in the Cariboo Central Interior region now. These are climate normals from the last 30 years. And on an annual basis, precipitation is a little larger than evaporation or potential evapotranspiration. It's about 100 millimeters more precipitation than evaporation. So on an annual basis, we could look at that and say, okay, we got to manage about 100 millimeters of excess water in our reclamation system. It might be that excess water, some of it will be runoff and some of it will go into underlying mine waste if that's something we're interested in. But it turns out an annual basis isn't a very good way of looking at this, because these terms aren't actually synchronous and they don't occur over the average year. They occur in smaller time steps. So rather than looking at those blue bars on the left from kind of November through March, April as being when precipitation occurs, it actually occurs when that precipitation, which is mostly coming as snow, is released through melting. And so what we have are these kind of two offsets. We've got a place where, unlike the average condition where precipitation is a bit more than evaporation, we've got a condition in which precipitation is a lot more than evaporation, about 170 millimeters more than the corresponding evaporation in the month of April, because plants aren't really very active, but snow is melting like crazy. And that big offset between the delivered precipitation and evaporation is the source of the bulk of that net flux term, Q, in the water balance, right? This is when we're going to have most of our water moving through our landscape, as you know, and it's when we're going to have, it's the source of the water that is going to be that contact water with mine waste if some of it is going to infiltrate into waste rock dumps. And then we've got this other offset, which interestingly in this case is about the same size, when potential evaporation, or the amount of water that vegetated ecosystems would use if they had it available, is larger than precipitation. And so that's the source of drought in these ecosystems. And in this particular site, it's about the same size. There's about 100, plants would use about 170 more millimeters of water if it was available to them than they can, really. And so that offset, that kind of atmospheric need for more water and plant need for more water than supply creates drought. And so although on an average basis, you could look at this and say, this should be a site that isn't really affected by drought in a normal year. Actually, drought is kind of annual and totally predictable, right? So we've got this situation in which we've got one imbalance which causes movement of water through the landscape for a short period of time. And then we've got another imbalance which lasts longer, which is the source of drought in this landscape. So I'm going to just quickly talk about some background around soil water storage. I'm going to take you back to your soil physics class in university, if you took a soil physics class in university, and talk about some ideas around available water storage capacity. So if you imagine a fully saturated soil, right, it's just rained heavily. I live on Vancouver Island this time of year, that's all it's doing. It's just rained heavily and kind of all of the pores in the soil are water filled. If it stops raining, that soil starts draining under gravitational drainage, and the soil suction increases, or the matrix potential, which has a negative sign with it, decreases. And somewhere around a suction of 10 to 30 kilopascals, we reach what soil scientists call field capacity, right? Which is when water drainage under gravitational forces have become negligible relative to other forces like transpiration. So without vegetation, this is about as dry as a soil can get, other than the kind of upper crust, which is actively evaporating. This is the kind of state at which soil or water in the soil is held in pores sufficiently kind of tightly that it doesn't drain under gravitational forces. So a soil will just stay at field capacity other than the kind of upper evaporative front. But if there are plants in the soil, those plants can keep withdrawing water from these smaller pores with their roots until somewhere around 1500 kilopascals, we reach a point that we call wilting point, which is, in an agricultural setting defined as the suction at which, the limitations on water uptake become sufficient for plants that they can't recover from that water deficit. In the ecosystems we work with in British Columbia, mostly what wilting point means is most plants are no longer able to take up water. They can't sort of exert enough osmotic potential with their roots to remove water from the micropores and kind of vapor phases that it's still held in. And so photosynthesis is largely stopped at this point. So we look at this spectrum for plants, at conditions around field capacity. There's no real limitations to plant water use. They're transpiring as much as they need to. They're photosynthesizing as much as they need to. But as that suction increases and we approach the wilting point, plants will have to start to constrain their photosynthesis and their use of water, right? They'll start to close their stomata to conserve water. And they're not dying, but they're also not photosynthesizing, and they can't do that forever. Eventually, they spend enough time at those suctions and they will die. And this kind of depends on the state of plant establishment as well, which is important in reclamation because we're always trying to establish new plants, right? We don't have established forests with their root networks, right? We're mostly trying to establish things at the seedling stage. And seedlings, because of the way their root systems work, are much more sensitive to this. So whereas a mature conifer might start constraining its water use at, say, 600 kilopascals of suction, a little seedling, if it experiences, say, 300 kilopascals of suction for a few months directly after planting, might be dead. So the difference then, and Trevor, this is a big part of the work Trevor's going to present and why we chose to spend some time on this, the difference between field capacity and wilting point, the difference in water content is what we call available water storage capacity, which is one way of measuring the ability of soils to store water for plant use. And materials with different particle size distributions have different storage capacities, which is something Trevor will talk more about as well. So coarser materials generally store less water than finer materials at field capacity. And remember, that's because field capacity is defined as the water content where drainage under gravitational forces has mostly ceased, and you need small pores to hold water at those tensions. So different materials store different amounts of water. So an illustration of this, which is pretty common in a kind of cover design world, is imagine two different kinds of material, one a waste rock and two a mineral soil that we're going to put a cover on top of. So that waste rock at field capacity at a tension of about 10 kilopascals has a water content, say, of 15%. At wilting point, it's got a water content of about 7%, and the difference then is 8%, or about 8 millimeters per centimeter. 8 millimeters of water held in that available water storage capacity range per centimeter of depth of material. So if we had 100 centimeters of waste rock, it would be storing 80 millimeters of water. If we look at the same things for the mineral soil, its field capacity is far higher because of the things we just talked about, right? Different materials, different particle size distributions, different pore size distributions have different storage capacities. So its water content at field capacity about 31%. Its water content at wilting point is also higher, but proportionately not as much higher as field capacity. So the difference then in its available water storage capacity is more than twice that of waste rock. And so this is one of the ways that we can start thinking about not only how will our use of cover materials over waste materials influence the kinds of ecosystems we can establish, but how much water can we store in these cover systems, and how does that mediate the movement of water through these landscapes? And you can see with a graph like this how we're starting to try to think about quantifying this and actually get some calculations that we can do design with. So if we go back to this diagram here, so in a vegetated system, if we think about the water balance Q minus P minus E minus, or Q equals P minus E minus delta S, in a well-vegetated system, transpiration, let me back up. In systems in BC, the dominant term in that water balance equation is precipitation, right? The climatic variation in how precipitation is delivered dominates the water balance. But the second largest term is evaporation, and in a well-vegetated system, transpiration is the dominant component of evaporation. Now, on kind of within the space of a growing season, the change in water storage in that upper cover layer, our ability to store water for periods of time, particularly to store water from snowmelt and store it long enough to release it to plant use, that delta S term within the year is important. It defines the size of the soil plant atmosphere pump, right? The more soil we can store, the more water we can store in the soil, the more vegetation we can establish, the more water that vegetation can remove. And if you think of my diversion ditch analogy, return to the atmosphere, right? The less water we store, probably the more water is going to make it through because we've got a smaller pump. And so here we're thinking about it from the water balance point of view, but also the more water we're able to store or the spectrum between more and less water storage will influence the kinds of ecosystems we can establish. On an annual basis, the change in storage of the cover should be about zero, right? It accumulates water, that water gets depleted. There's no kind of year over year change in storage. And so on an annual basis, we can consider that the flux term that we're interested in, if we're interested in things like water movement through waste rock dumps, is basically precipitation minus evaporation. And that plays into the modeling tool that Trevor's going to present in a bit. So last couple slides before the break, I want to just go back to this idea of what we're trying to do is combine these ideas around ecohydrology, right? Water, the way vegetated soil and plant ecosystems influence the movement of water through the landscape with the BEC system. want to think about that as a tool for understanding both capability and water movement, and think particularly right now about this pre-mining to post-mining comparison. So pre-mining is usually pretty easy. This is a diagram from the Yukon. So the language that's getting used in the legend is different than what we would use in the BC BEC system, but it's the same people working on it, the same sort of conceptual model. It's pretty easy for us to, either because we did it before we had a mine for new mines, or because we have historic air photos that predate mining, it's pretty easy for us to come up in the BEC system with a quantification of the pre-mining environment, right? We can map those pre-mining ecosystems and quantify them. In mine reclamation, what we're trying to think about then is, how do we replace those ecosystems, or ecosystems that are comparable? How do we measure their replacement? How do we kind of marry this business about how do we do soil cover design and revegetation design? And then how do we do these comparisons to this pre-mining landscape to understand implications for capability? And before we take our break and we hand it over to Trevor, the last slide is just really thinking about, we always want to be thinking about two things in our reclamation design. We want to be thinking about, how do these designs, how do the decisions we make in terms of cover placement, cover design, and the things we do with vegetation, how do they mediate the establishment of ecosystems in the reclaimed landscape? What are we trying to establish? What kinds of ecosystems are we establishing? What are we trying to establish them for what capability, for what land use? And just emphasizing, simultaneously, we want to think about, how do these reclamation designs and the resulting or emerging ecosystems mediate that movement of water through the reclaimed landscape, right? Because like I said earlier, whether we think we are doing it or not, we're always simultaneously doing these two things when we work in the sort of agrology portion of reclamation, where we design and replace soils or soil-like materials, growth media, and try to revegetate them with plants. And that's the kind of eco-hydrological linkage that we're trying to get at in these tools that Trevor's going to present. So I've left 1 minute for questions, which is probably not very good. Adriana, maybe we can hold those questions until after the break and start with them, and then move on to Trevor.
Sounds good.
Great. Well, we'll see you all then at 2:20. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you guys.
Hi, folks. Adriana, my computer tells me it's 2:20, so I'm going to start up again if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. We have a question from Tyler 14.
Yeah, I can see the question, so I could answer it directly if that works for you.
Sounds good. Thanks.
And apparently Trevor tried to message me 80 minutes ago and say, it'd be better if you use your video. It's more personal. So I'll do it for 10 seconds before I turn it over to Trevor.
It's not too late.
Yeah, too late. Tyler, your question is, can the amount of absorption through water balance by increasing soil thickness pose issues to ramping rates in rivers for fish species? And I guess like the short answer, I think, is yes. And that's partly what the point that I was trying to emphasize around, the importance of being aware that we're always kind of making two kinds of decisions simultaneously in reclamation. One is around ecosystem establishment and one is around water movement. So I don't have any experience directly with the exact question you're asking, but as an analog, certainly in oil sands reclamation, one of the things that oil sands mining does is converts a landscape, which is, say, 50% wetland and 50% upland, into a landscape that's much more like, 80% upland. And the problem with the kind of climatic water balance in the oil sands region is that precipitation and potential evaporation are pretty equal. And so the situation we get into is if you're building all this upland landscape and you're, as oil sands reclamation at least was at one period, if you're conservative against the risk that your forests won't be productive enough, a way you can compensate that with, a way you can try to compensate for that is to build thicker soil covers. And because there's kind of abundant peat resources in the oil sands region, you can build thicker soil covers with more organic matter in them that can actually store a lot of water. And you can get pretty productive forested ecosystems growing on those peat mineral mix soil covers that are essentially kind of water hogs. So they'll use all the water they can get. And one of the things we have to be really active about designing for is, how do we design then, if one of our goals is wetland reclamation, how do we design reclamation where we're not using up too much water in this kind of upland storage scenario? And so certainly for areas in which you have fish in streams in mining landscapes, the storage not only of the soil cover, but the storage of the underlying waste materials can have an impact on how water moves through those ecosystems, and generally sort of tends to dampen the hydrograph, right? Instead of getting flashy systems, now you've got deeper materials in which the kind of rapidity at which water moves through the landscape is kind of attenuated. So hopefully that's helpful. But yes, definitely something that, thanks, Kyle. Something to think about. Trevor, I think, Adriana, I guess I should ask if there's any more questions, but otherwise it's over to Trevor.
Yeah, I think we are good. Thanks, Justin.
Okay, over to me. Can everybody hear me? Adriana?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly.
Perfect. Okay, well, I'm going to start this with the video on just because then I actually have a body behind the voice. So yeah, my name is Trevor Baker. I'm a soil scientist with IEG, and recently I became an articling agrologist after many years of dragging my heels. So I'm part of the club now. I'm coming to you from Silk territory, specifically that of the Penticton Indian Band. And thank you, Justin, for setting the stage for me with the slides, and also, I guess you could say, setting the stage in my career. I sort of walked into IEG right when Justin was trying to answer some of these quantitative questions. So it's a pleasure to work on this, and it's been a fascinating journey. So I'm going to dive right into my slides here. I'm going to turn the video off just in case it is messing with streaming. Let's see. I believe I'm gone now. So yeah, as Justin was talking about, what is ecohydrology? And it's the study of interaction between water and ecosystems. And in the reclamation context, just as on Justin's last slides, this is pretty much a direct repeat. It's how we'll cover design, i.e. soil water storage, or maybe it should say soil water supply, because it's not all from storage. Some can be from land forming and whatnot that adds water that's available to plants. So how can this influence the establishment of reclaimed ecosystems and mediate the movement of water on the reclaimed landscape? And when we're thinking about this in terms of mine reclamation, we're basically starting with what I'm going to talk about today is trying to quantify the water balances of ecosystems. And this leads us towards understanding the linkages between water balances and the presence of plants in ecosystems, which then, using some of the techniques I'm going to talk about, helps us to predict the presence of ecosystems on reclaimed landscapes, which feeds into an iterative process towards optimizing the use of cover materials, which tend to be, although not always, in short supply. So we're trying to figure out where they're going to make the most marginal benefit, and then how can we also use land forming to influence things towards making the sort of targeted revegetation and construction strategies that we're hoping for as outcomes from the mine reclamation process. And then also directly from quantifying the water balances, something that's of interest to folks on the engineering side, especially, or the hydrology side, site-wide water balances. So understanding some of the terms that Justin introduced in his slides. So BC's BEC system is divided into zones, and this is the system that we use for sort of the basis of trying to talk about the changes in capability on the landscape. So the BEC system is divided into zones, and those are based on the climax vegetation, usually trees, although bunch grass is also one of them, those species. And those come out on this map here. And so each one of these colors is a different climax vegetation species, and those are the foundation of the BEC zones. And when we look at the graphs of mean annual precipitation and mean annual temperature, you can sort of see the correlation in terms of color patterns where precipitation and temperature essentially feed into deciding what types of ecosystems are we going to have on the landscape. Specifically, probably precipitation has a perhaps greater influence. So that feeds that's support for the idea of ecohydrology as the basis of this. And if we look on a more local area, this map here, apologies, it's really small, but the box is surrounding Williams Lake, and it shows different BEC zones and then subzones and variants. So there's the IDF, the interior Douglas fir, and the subboreal spruce, and then they're divided into sort of these more specific climatic subdivisions based on the temperature and precipitation regimes within them. And then within one of these given subzones or variants here for the subboreal pine spruce, these edotopic grids, they indicate the site series, and site series essentially are the ecosystems within the local area, and these are determined by edaphic factors. So these edotopic grids are a tool that we use in the BEC system to help us to classify ecosystems, and essentially each one of these colored boxes is a different ecosystem, and it exists at a different sort of axis of soil moisture regime and soil nutrient regime. So those coordinates can help us to understand what types of ecosystems are going to grow in this particular moisture regime and nutrient regime within this particular subzone or variant. And of primary importance from our view, and probably just in terms of how ecosystems develop on a landscape, soil moisture regime, which is essentially the product of the available water volume during the growing season, or which is manifested in sort of the severity and frequency of summer droughts. That's the moisture regime axis, and it runs down the y-axis of these grids from dry to wet. And then soil nutrient regime runs along the x-axis from poor to rich, and SNR is largely a product of the moisture regime in terms of more water makes more productivity and a richer SNR, although temperature regime also does feed into that. So here we have the nutrient regime from poor to rich, and along an edotopic grid, you tend to see a typical layout which ecosystems sort of start at the dry, poor area of the grid and move, somewhat diagonally across the grid towards the wetter and richer. And this is based on data from a plot database that I'm going to be talking about later. So this is more than 5,000 plots and just plotting the moisture regimes against the nutrient regimes. And so you can see that the very poor nutrient regimes tend to be associated with the drier moisture regimes near the top of the grid, and the richer nutrient regimes are associated with the wetter moisture regimes. So soil moisture regime is something I've already said probably a dozen times, and I'll say it a few dozen more. So it's important to understand what is a soil moisture regime. So defined explicitly, it's the capacity of a soil to hold, lose, or receive water determined from soil's properties and landscape positions, regardless of climate. And the thing I have underlined here is the regardless of climate part, which is quite important to the soil moisture regime concept. So what this essentially means is that the inherent properties of each class don't vary depending on the climate, and one soil moisture regime classification system should cover the entire province. So no need to reinvent the wheel depending where you're at. The properties that make a dry moisture regime, they are the same no matter if you're on the coast where lots of precipitation is getting dumped in, or in the dry interior where I am, where the ecosystems will be different, but the moisture regime that they grow on is classified in the same way. So there's going to be different ecosystems, but soil moisture regime is classified the same way in every climate, whether you have a forest growing on a dry xeric SMR or next to nothing growing on it in a drier climate. The site is classified in the same way with the same properties. So just to give some sort of visual examples of what this looks like, these photos are from the Logan Lake area near HVC mine, just to give an idea of what these things might look like. So this first one is of a xeric soil moisture regime, and the definition of that is water is removed very rapidly. Soil is moist for a brief period after precipitation. And the thing that I've highlighted these in terms of these definitions of them are, they're descriptive in some way, but they're not very quantitative. It's difficult to understand, what is a brief period for xeric, or if we're looking at submesic, which is a deeper and coarser soil, but almost always on slopes, then what is a moderately short period? And looking further down the grid towards the mesic soil moisture regime, these would be deeper soils, typically with low coarse fragment contents, and probably not sloped very steeply. So that's an example of 3 of the moisture regimes along the grid, just to give an idea of what these might express like in the Logan Lake area. If I were to draw these pictures from different parts of the province, you would see similar sort of patterns moving from sparser forest to more lush, more green forest that's more productive with larger trees and such. But that pattern is common across no matter where you are. So when we're classifying soil moisture regime, I'm sure a number of people here are familiar with the classification keys that we use. And these are the standard methods that have been sort of gifted to us, passed down from our BEC ancestors. So there's classification keys such as the score-based key here, where different numeric scores are assigned based on slope position, gradient, soil texture, coarse fragment content, and whatnot. And you sum all those up, and at the bottom, your sum total for that site falls into a bin, and that helps you to assign a soil moisture regime. Then the dichotomous key version, of which I've just snipped out the lower and toe slope position key, And then the third thing that we would have to use if we were working in a natural environment is characteristic plant species. So these would be unique to each subzone or variant. And in the Logan Lake area where I've taken these photos from, we have kinnick, which is an indicator of one of the drier soil moisture regimes, and twin flower, which is an indicator of the mesic soil moisture regime. So these can be very useful when you're in the field trying to understand what you're looking at. There are some shortcomings with these soil moisture regime classification methods, and one that bothers me as a data-minded person, I guess, is the use of categories for continuous variables. So there's certain things in the dichotomous key, or even in the score system to a lesser extent. The soil depth is either less than or greater than 50 centimeters and gets binned into shallow or deep, where soil is classed as fine or coarse. And what we really think and what's true in reality is that these are continuous variables, and shallow goes from, the depth goes from shallow to deep, which is shades of gray in the middle. So trying to think of a classification system that can somewhat reflect this. And then another shortcoming that I would mention specifically for reclamation, and most specifically for unbuilt landforms. So when mines are in planning stages, and we're talking about, well, if they exist, they're very young ecosystems where the plants that are present are probably relics of management decisions, and not really, I guess you would say, reflective of the ultimate site potential, or something that's unbuilt. It exists only in spreadsheets and GIS, and so you can't use an indicator plant for that. And then another issue that we've seen through, Jessica, I see your question, and I'm gonna jump on it in 1 second. Reclamation specific shortcomings. The keys we just find when we're trying to apply them in the field, they seem somewhat inaccurate. So one of the main things that drives the classifications with the standard keys that have been developed for natural ecosystems, that slope position is of primary importance. And there's a presumption, and in natural ecosystems, it tends to hold that water is transferred along slopes. So you'd have an impermeable layer, bedrock or basal till or something like that underneath. And the size of those blue arrows shows that a lot of the water gets moved downwards along the slope or catena through rooting zones, and very little of it is lost vertically. Whereas when we're working in mine reclamation, we have cover soils that are on top of waste. In this illustration, waste rock, but tailings is another permeable sort of underlying layer. And so the size of the arrows has switched here. There's less water moving down the slope through the rooting zone, and a lot more of it is being lost vertically. So what that leads us to is, if we were using a dichotomous key for reclamation, and we had the example of the toe of a waste rock dump without soil cover, so this is just bare waste rock, and we tried to apply the dichotomous key, we would say, well, there's no water table or seepage present, very rarely is, and the soil particle size is coarse, so it leads us to thinking that the moisture regime is mesic or subhydric. And if you remember what those photos looked like of mesic or subhydric, you got to ask, is it really going to become something like this? Or is it going to look more like this, sort of a sparser, less productive forest? And I would argue, and experience tells me, that it may not look exactly like this sub-xeric ecosystem, but it's going to look a lot more like that than the former. Just 1 second. Jessica. Well, Jessica knows moisture regimes. So there are two soil moisture regimes, ASMR, absolute or actual soil moisture regime. That's one of my pet things to talk to people about. And you're right. So it does take into a climate. So it's not something I'm going to talk about today. It is something that we do deal with in the system, but it kind of would take up another sort of half an hour presentation. So when I'm talking about soil moisture regime in this presentation, it's going to be about relative soil moisture regime, which does not vary by climate. ASMR does vary by climate, and it's defined by I guess there's sort of two quantitative ways that it's defined. One is by a ratio of actual evapotranspiration to potential evapotranspiration, or the other is by the length of growing season water deficits. And yeah, so I don't know, you can invite me back next year and I can talk to everybody about ASMR, but that is a good point, and I will be almost exclusively talking about RSMR. I hope that answers it. Hit another question in there if it doesn't. Okay, switching slides here. So these SMR classification keys depend on things like soil texture, soil depth, compaction, seepage, topography, and all of these can be quantified in terms of water supply and demand using soil physics, or soil physics and I guess in terms of slope and aspect, meteorological modeling. But all of them can be quantified in terms of water supply and demand, which is leading into what Justin was introducing about when he was talking about, well, just put 50 centimeters on it. Why? I don't know. So this is sort of the genesis of us looking at these things in terms of a more quantitative way. And so our goal is to create a system for soil moisture regime classification. And last year I did present a paper at the BC Technical Research Committee on Reclamation. I believe that's what the acronym stands for. Presenting some of these preliminary things and preliminary findings that we've had through our work. And our work is not yet done. It continues, but that's that's the best summary that we have of it so far. So we're creating a system for classifying that is suited for reclamation applications and informed by our field observations. It can answer key reclamation questions regarding material suitability. So do we salvage this soil or that soil, or what is the marginal benefit of using this soil over that soil? And then optimal cover placement depths, feeding into what Justin was talking about with the expense of making decisions on a 10 centimeter cover increment. This kind of approach can help us to understand what depth makes sense, and supporting it through a more scientific process. And we also want a system that can be integrated with the soil water balance model, and that requires data that can be easily measured or reasonably estimated, so that practitioners can put it into practice, without very much data or expert knowledge, I suppose you would say. So in order to do this, we used a provincial BEC survey database. It's more than 5,000 upland plots is what we use. So in reclamation, we're mostly dealing with upland sites, that is those that don't collect water, so not wetlands, not influenced substantially by seepage. And this graph here just shows that that database, just like the landscape outside our doors, is skewed towards things being somewhat, within that sub-xeric to mesic range. There's not very many xeric sites, which would be essentially bare bedrock, and less xeric and sub-hygric sites as well. And so the first step in doing this was to calculate plant available water storage capacity, and Justin talked about the principles behind that. And in order to do so, we use two peer-reviewed models, and they take in particle size distribution, organic matter content, and bulk density in order to give an estimated AWSC. We adjust results for fine over coarse layering, which is in reclamation typically a finer cover soil over a coarser waste rock layer, and that essentially increases the storage in the overlying fine layer. I won't get into the nitty gritty on that, but we do account for that. And then we include any AWSC from surface organics, so litter or organic horizons. And the water balance model that we use is based on these AWSC calculations, and it uses Climate BC data for past and future periods. So can select climate normals from the past, these 30-year climate normals, or from future modeled climates, so sort of 30-year intervals that are centered on 2025, 2055, and 2085, and these can be modified by 3 climate change intensities. And then it is a daily filling bucket model that's run over a water year. So this here is the sort of a sketch of how this filling bucket water balance model works. It's pretty crude, but it does what we want it to do, or does it fairly well anyways. So the bucket there is the ultimate size of it is determined by AWSC, whereas the amount of water in the bucket, that is called here SMS, or soil moisture storage. And precipitation, that's from Climate BC or Climate WNA, depending where we're working, which I should say is a publicly available model. I believe climatewna.com is the address, and it's a great tool, and we wouldn't be nearly where we are without it. So when precipitation falls, the first question is the temperature greater than 0? If it is, then precipitation is rain, and if the soil moisture storage is full, then that water is lost from the system. It gets put into the excess water column. If it's not full, then that rainwater is added. And if the precipitation is less than 0, then snow is added to snowpack with a adjustment for sublimation losses. And then when the temperature does go above 0, again, if soil moisture storage is full, then that meltwater goes to the excess water column. And if it's not full, then melt gets added. So you can see in these 3 buckets here so far, we've added water on this daily time step. And then the final step is to extract water. So PET, again, also from the Climate BC model. And if PET is greater than the soil moisture storage, then the actual evapotranspiration, AET, just equals the soil moisture storage. And if there's enough soil moisture storage to support it, then AET equals PET. And I should say that this AET is, I guess, what we call a theoretical maximum. So it would be rare or uncommon for AET to actually equal PET, because there's lots of ways that plants might not be 100% effective in turning soil water into transpiration, but this running total of AET over the water year gives us an idea of the envelope, the maximum theoretical AET that a site could produce. And then for the next day, soil moisture storage is transferred over to the next day. And then this runs again, and it goes for 365 days. So that was a water balance. I'll talk about the outputs from the model there, but I guess first just talk about how we predict soil moisture regime. So we're using linear regression models. I'm working in my MSc, which is ongoing, to try to use other methods such as neural networks to improve the prediction accuracy. But for now, in this sort of beta version, we're using linear regression models. And so we're selecting parameters that can be easily measured or estimated for unbuilt landforms. And we're splitting them by slope position groups, water shedding or water receiving slope position groups, and using training and testing data sets, iterating through in order to derive mean coefficients for this linear regression model. And the evaluation metrics that we've used is the exact accuracy, the plus or minus 1 class accuracy. So if the model is predicting submesic, then is the true prediction in subxeric, which is the drier neighbor, or mesic, the wetter neighbor, the root mean square error, and Cohen's kappa, which is essentially just a metric that assesses the quality of a prediction model. And through the work that we've done so far, we've got 2 linear regression models, one for water shedding slope positions, where soil moisture regime is predicted from AWSC, soil depth, the slope angle, and the proportion of coarse fragments in the upper 50 centimeters of the soil, the CF50 there. And in water receiving slope positions, it's predicted from AWSC and slope. And then there's a few conditional rules that are applied on top of that, such as a crest slope position can't have a SMR greater than or equal to 4, or mesic or wetter. And this here is the evaluation of our model versus running the dichotomous and score-based keys. And so these two results right here, these are the score-based and dichotomous key, and they predict, they do essentially similarly well, I guess you could say, with 39 to 40% exact accuracy and root mean square error just under one class that would be. And this is how our model does in comparison to that. So it's a higher exact accuracy and plus or minus one class accuracy. Kappa is lower than one, higher than the other, and the root mean square error is lower. And so it's lower than we'd like, I would say, in terms of the kappa. Like 0.23 is not an outstanding result, but it is heartening that it is similar to the existing tools that we have to use. And the benefit of the system, so it's comparable or better, you could say, in terms of these assessments, but the benefit is that it does recognize things like continuous variables for slope and depth, so you can tweak these and understand how landform design might be changed, whereas if you were using the dichotomous keys, you have to trip over one of those sort of binary class boundaries from shallow to deep or something like that, whereas this can talk about the difference between 40 or 45 centimeters of soil. And then the other benefit is that it is quantitative and water balance based, so that it can be used with the water balance approaches that we're going with. So this has culminated in an online tool for reclamation design. It's available at qea.iugsoil.com, I should say, because I'm sure everybody is just running to use it right now. It's set up right now for just one user at a time. So if you get a whole bunch of users, everybody sort of has to wait behind the other person for calculations to run. If there's one user on there, it takes about a minute to use the tool. If you've got 20 users on there, then the 20th person might be waiting for quite a while. And this tool is designed for reclamation managers, consultants, regulators, or mine-affected communities and their representatives. So I'm just going to briefly go over what this online tool looks like. These are just screenshots from the web app. So the site properties that you might put in, the subzone, the variant, latitude, longitude, slope position, slope angle, the aspect, various things like that. And then soil properties, there's 3 ways that you can enter them. If it's sort of a traditional field survey where you just have hand textures, then hand textures are accepted. Or if you have lab data, then you can give quantitative sand, silt, and clay. Or if you have even better lab data, you can give sort of a breakdown of the sand sizes, because one thing that comes out in these AWSC models is that the finer sands are quite important for storing water, whereas coarser sands are not. So that's the idea behind that. So we'll take any sort of soil data that you have, and then you select these climate settings. So what sort of climate envelope do you want to run the water balance routine in? So you've got your historical normals, future periods, and then the climate change intensity settings. So different relative concentration pathways from moderate through extreme. We're in the process of updating these right now to come in line with the latest releases from Climate WNA. So this is what the outputs of the tool look like. This is we'll have to process all at once, but this is the output screen, and I'm just going to break it down piece by piece. So after you've waited, after pressing calculate, wait a minute or 20 minutes if there's 20 people on there, you end up with these soil characteristics. So some of these are what you've input. There's an estimated bulk density. You are allowed to put in sort of a qualitative observation of how compact the soil is, and then using some models, data sets that we have from other places, an estimated fine fraction bulk density is given. Available water storage capacity, whether that's for the material itself on a meter basis, or the layer AWSC, which is how much water storage is that particular layer with that given depth that you've input, contributing to the profile AWSC, which is the sum total of all the layers. And then the effect of soil layering on AWSC. And the site characteristics that come out of these are sort of fall into two categories. The categories we keep talking about, water balances. So we have precipitation on an annual and growing season basis, the evapotranspiration, so that's the potential, which is defined by the climate, or the maximum theoretical, which comes from the water balance model, cumulative water deficits, so climatic and soil water deficits, climatic being precipitation, or PET minus precipitation, and soil water deficit being mediated by the available water storage capacity. And Jessica, to your point about ASMR, there is also, I don't have it circled there, but there's an AET max to PET ratio, and that's what we use to classify things in terms of ASMR classes. And then here we have the excess water, so the runoff plus the net percolation components, so how much extra water is not going to be, even in its sort of maximum evapotranspiration state, how much water is going to be lost from the system. And these all get summarized in a water balance graph that the tool outputs. And I won't go through all these lines, but basically just month by month, how does the model come up with these things? So this graph is one of the outputs of the tool. And then here are soil moisture regime classifications, so ASMR and RSMR, actual or absolute and relative, and site series. And it will also give you a ecotopic grid where I have not touched on it, but we have a soil nutrient regime sort of estimation routine. And so based on the soil moisture regime rules that we have in the soil nutrient regime, it places this site in the submesic SMR, medium SNR, and it's sort of on the boundary of two site series groups on the grid. So that's given in text form and then also in graphical form. So yeah, there's ongoing work on the app. It's in beta stage. Feedback is definitely welcome. So yeah, if anybody happens to use it and has any ideas, please send them along. We're happy for that. And then I'm doing my master's at UBC under Doctors Andy Black, Leslav Klitsch, and Tom Lee Wang. And some of the goals in my master's are to improve the classification accuracy using machine learning or neural network, calibrating it with our fieldwork findings, and integrating it with some more spatial kind of models of water transfer along slopes to better understand how slope position plays into soil moisture regime classifications, or I guess I should say into available soil water supply, and then how that relates to soil moisture regime classifications. And then of course publishing my thesis when I ever get around to it, and peer-reviewed papers. And one of the big sort of ongoing questions that we have, and I see I have 3 minutes left in my allotted time, but I'm going to say I started late and I'm probably going to run about 5 minutes after here. So apologies, folks, but I'll try to make it brief. One of the pieces of ongoing work that we have is not just us at IEG, but everybody in the mine reclamation community, is just understanding the implications of climate change on the ecosystems that we project to be there, water balances, and reclamation planning. So this is probably a new graph that people haven't seen, but it's it's something that I think we're all familiar with at this point. So temperature is rising in most seasons in most of BC, and this includes the central interior, which is graphed here. The summer and winter temperatures are both going up over these climate change scenarios that have been run. And precipitation is a little bit more complex, where across BC it's going up everywhere, and in the central interior that's true also. Whereas in the summer, precipitation is on a downward trend in some areas, or roughly even in some areas as well. And in the central interior, that's borne out by these projections also. So summer is going to be warmer and relatively the same precipitation, whereas winter is going to be warmer and wetter. And the sort of upshot of this, or a neat summary, I think, that I came across in looking at this in some of my research, is that there's novel climates that are predicted to emerge in BC. So climates that BC's BEC system has no theoretical foundation with, no experience with. we have these growing season conditions. So we've got in this graph summer and winter on the left and right, and precipitation on the y-axis, and maximum temperature on the x-axis. And you can see these envelopes where there's a blue climate envelope, and that's the historical normal, and then this orange climate envelope, and a lot of it overlaps, but some of it is sort of outside the boundaries of what we've known before, and these are novel climates by the author's terminology. And so in the summer side, things are generally, although not always, going hotter and drier, and in the winter they're going up and to the right, so wetter and warmer. And of particular sort of relevance to the central interior, there's a variant of the subboreal pine and spruce, and its climate, it's highlighted there in red, and then that arrow leads it to where that green box is. So the arrow is saying that in 2050, the climate in this historic area, which has been mapped as subboreal pine and spruce, supports those forests right now. It's going to have an interior cedar hemlock kind of climate. And same again with the ESSF, so the high elevation ESSF is going to be similar to the montane spruce. And this IDF variant, one that I don't believe is present in the central interior, but it's a drier interior Douglas fir variant. It's moving into the novel climate space, so sort of outside of the range. So if you're in the subboreal pine and spruce and things are moving to a climate that's somewhat like the ICH, well, you might be able to take an ICH etotopic grid and field guide, but if you're in this IDF variant, you don't have the ability to do that. It's outside of the scope of what we know right now. So just showing this in terms of a map, this dot is placed on Gibraltar Mine, which is, I guess, just east of Highway 97 between Williams Lake and Cornell. And so that's for reference, that's where the dot is. And historically, the central interior has been primarily subboreal pine and spruce and subboreal spruce. So these blue mapped zones, and then in the mid to high elevations, the pink and purple are the montane spruce and the Engelmann spruce subalpine fir, and then to a lesser extent in the lower Fraser and Chilcotin valleys, there's been interior Douglas fir and some small amount of bunch grass in the sort of hottest parts of the central interior. And when we look at the future BEC zones for this 2041 to 2070 period, what you can see here, if I just flip back and forth, it's gone from blue to green and yellow. So there's a lot of interior cedar hemlock. So that's saying that in these areas that historically have or continue to have subboreal spruce, subboreal pine and spruce, the climate is going to be like the interior cedar hemlock or even the interior Douglas fir. And in the mid to high elevations, you've got ICH, IDF, and montane spruce, and then severely reduced or gone, there's the subboreal pine and spruce, subboreal spruce, and Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir are essentially gone from the landscape. So this presents us some interesting questions when we're trying to predict ecosystems and understand, especially for mine reclamation projects that go for decades into the future. So things that we have to think about, and we don't always have the right answers for these, but these are the ways that we're framing our discussions is what time frame are we planning for? What BEC units are projected to occur in that area? Another question that would be related to the time frame is what climate change severity are we going to plan with? And when we're talking about what BEC units are projected to occur, is it feasible for this migration to occur? So in the Cariboo, where you have IDF variants that are moving upslope, you can kind of see how the propagation and the migration of the ecosystem might occur over time. But what about the interior cedar hemlock moving hundreds of kilometers? Like the ecosystem obviously is not just gonna, it doesn't just move. So what you end up with is the previous ecosystem that might be struggling to adapt under the new conditions, and then new species that may or may not be able to get there, competing, and like what will these hybrid ecosystems look like, and what species can adapt and which may disappear. And then as planners and people involved in sort of establishing new sites in reclamation, how can we assist that migration? So taking planting stock from other regions, and how do we think of species lists? And what certainty do these projections have? It's definitely not an exact science right now. And getting into, I guess, what Justin was talking about restoring things to equivalent capability, or equal to, or I don't know what the exact language is, but how do we assess reclamation versus pre-development baselines when what was there in the pre-development timeframe is independent of the mining changing? And so what do we assess our reclamation against? And how do you communicate that with, especially with indigenous communities who are used to the landscape being a certain way, and you have to say, well, we don't think that it's feasible to put back what was there before, and it might not be because of what's been happening in reclamation, or what the mines have done or not done. It's just because of the underlying baseline conditions being different. So I believe that that's all my slides, and it's back to Justin.
Thanks, Trevor. That was great. I enjoyed listening to it. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with some time to have an open discussion, which is great. Partly because what we're trying to do here is we've suggested some approaches to mine reclamation and a tool to address some of the technical challenges we talked about. I guess one question for you, Trevor, we've got the link here again. You said we encourage feedback, so we're pretty excited about this. It represents about 10 years of Trevor and me working together, Trevor mostly with the brains and me with some dumb questions. But Trevor, you said we encourage feedback. So how does that feedback occur?
It would just have to be by email. I think I've got my email pasted on that site, but it is tbaker@iegconsulting.com. I'm sure we can be found on Google and whatnot. And if you want to send feedback, please find us. There's no feedback form though, if that's what you're asking.
No, I'm just asking how they do it. So that's great. And like I said, we're excited about this. And I think that, part of what, oh man, I got to find my advance button. Part of what we're trying to say here is we are not saying, like, we've chosen to make this freely available. We're very interested in other people using it and other ideas, etc. We're not saying that these are the only ways you can get at these problems, but I guess the kind of, one summary of our presentation today is kind of a plea for those of us working in this field to at least kind of try to make sure that the approaches we use are quantitative and have a rigorous scientific basis, and also that we kind of de-silo ourselves as much as possible so that we are more effective as agrologists at talking to engineers about things like water balances, etc., right? So that we are considering the implications of reclamation design kind of regardless of our area of expertise or specialty across our range of disciplines. So I think with that, we'll leave it there, and thank you so much for your attention. I know that 2 hours is a long time to listen to remote presentations, even though we've all kind of gotten used to it. And we're excited to have some discussion with you folks and hear some ideas. But thanks again.